Welcome to the Studio Dialogue session, Australia's Borders, Risks and Opportunities. My name's Lachlan Colquhoun. I'm the founder of Agantur Advisory and a 30-year national security veteran in the Commonwealth Public Service. And I am joined today by two eminent experts. For today's session, we'll discuss Australia's borders from traditional national security dimensions to trade and movement of people, to innovative perspectives and their untapped economic potential. To support the conversation, I'd like to introduce our experts. First, my former colleague, Mike Outram, former Commissioner of the Australian Border Force and a distinguished advisor here at the ANU National Security College. Mike led the Australian Border Force for 7 years and transformed its operating model to deliver agile, intelligence-led border protection across Australia's maritime and trade domains. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
And Professor Alan Gamlen. Professor Gamlen is an ARC Future Fellow and Director of the ANU Migration Hub. He's a social scientist specialising in large-scale interdisciplinary research on human migration, mobility and identity. Alan has held academic appointments at institutions including Oxford, Stanford, the Max Planck Society, Wellington University, the Japan Centre for Area Studies, and most importantly, my alma mater, Monash University. So welcome, Alan. I'm going to jump straight into the questions. And as I said, feel free to get as creative as you want. And let's have an interesting session. First question is going to be about the theme of the conference, which has really been resilience. When we talk about border resilience, for each of you, and I'll ask you first, Mike, what does that mean in practice for Australia? I mean, in your NSC paper, you talked about Australia's border seeing $1.2 trillion in goods transverse it annually. Roughly the Australian population travels across the border each year. So particularly ensuring the movement of trade, goods and people during crises, what does border resilience mean?
So I'll start with the framing there. I think if you can think about the border in those physical terms about movement of people and goods across borders, and of course it is in part that, but it's also where I think national security and economic security policy, sovereign decision-making all collide or converge, and it's where we give effect to things like sanctions enforcement, tariffs and those sorts of things. So the first thing is the framing of the border, and I've got no doubt, Alan, we're going to different framing again, so the framing is important. But really, for me, resilience is about absorbing shocks during crisis and keeping it moving, keeping goods and people moving at the same time. That's how you get what real resilience looks like. And if I think back to, I don't want to think back, but I will think back to COVID. We'd never managed anything like that since probably the war, and we had to close our border. I was the commissioner at the time. Those that with me would remember it very well. And then we had to implement a regime whereby I had to approve people coming to Australia or leaving Australia, case by case, based on very narrow criteria. We didn't have a system for that. We had to set a system up from scratch, and then we had to reopen the border. And every time a decision was made, a policy decision was made, it took time to filter through the system to implementation. And the feedback loop, so how well we're able to implement the government's intent at the border, was very slow. So I would say the lack of agility, the lack of flexibility in the border as a system was a problem. So we had people filling in bits of paper, you might remember, doing declarations. My officers were photocopying those bits of paper, and then they were transmitting the photocopies to a company who were digitizing those bits of paper, and the relevant health authorities would get that information, if they were lucky, within 70 hours of the person arriving. So I would say that a more resilient border has to be fully digital, where you can collect that data in advance of somebody getting on an airplane, for example. So I'll stop there, Lachlan. Yeah. That to me is what resilience is about. So that ability to absorb the shocks, but keep it moving.
Okay. Alan, for you?
Yeah,
a more resilient border?
That's really well put. I guess for me, border resilience is about the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining a boundary between inside and outside. And a very important part of that, as Mike's just sort of emphasised, not exclusively, but it has emphasised, is physical. The physical boundary between what passes into the territory and goes out as well. There's also what's inside and outside in a social sense of society. We've gone through a long period of history up until late modernity, kind of the late 20th century, that those two things have been the same. Inside and outside of a territory is the same as inside and outside of a society. But now we live in a world where your identity and your belonging might be less territorially based or even deterritorialized. And so the border is now sort of a more social and ideological thing. It's about being an insider of a group or an outsider of a group, which doesn't necessarily coincide with a spatial group, with a group in a place. So from the point of view of migration, that changes, how you think about what risk is, how you understand and how you manage risk. So a conventional kind of physical border understanding of border resilience emphasizes regulating the risks of bad actors going across a physical border, whereas a more social approach says, okay, what are the risks associated with insider and outsider status within the territory? What are the risks associated with outsiders having outside access to people inside the territory? And so there's a very different understanding of the kinds of risks that might arise in a crisis and how we should address them. COVID's a great example, which maybe we can talk about some more.
I might jump around a bit because you've just perfectly segued into a comment Minister Burke said during his speech last night, where he said that for most of our existence, we've had to think about borders and think about bad actors and bad goods as things that needed to traverse a border. So you needed to cross a border, whereas now increasingly you just need to open a browser. So technology is transforming border management. And you've talked about the outsider affecting the insider and the insider affecting the outsider. I mean, for quite a long time, we had an Australian who was a member of ISIS who was in the caliphate in the Middle East recruiting Australians in Australia through the power of the internet. From digital trade systems to biometric travel systems, I mean, what sort of role do you see technology playing in making those physical borders more resilient and efficient in the future? Mike, I'll throw that to you first.
Yeah, and firstly, I would say that the sort of traditional notion of the border isn't derelict. There's still a lot of people and a lot of stuff moves across the border,
Of course.
Nearly $1 trillion in two-way trade, etc. But these overlapping dimensions now of social media and radicalisation and anger and division that are being sown, there's a question there about, is that traditional border management? I would say it's probably not. But the next point I would make is that at the moment, Australia's integrated cargo system, I'll name that, is nearly a quarter of a century old.
Yeah.
And this is the system through which we regulate and manage trade, and industry use it. 1.2 billion transactions a year. And I would say what worries me the most now is that the architecture we've built and the paradigm of border management is based on a world that no longer exists. And there is a range of threats that are sort of emerging now that are just not able to be detected by that system. So I'll give you an example. Sanctions evasion is one where we just can't see whether we're buying petrol that contains mainly Russian oil.
Yeah.
Because we haven't got visibility of the system. Visibility is the decisive factor here. Another one would be trade-based money laundering that's crypto-enabled. We can't see the payments layer. So for those of you who don't know, trade-based money laundering is the sort of obfuscation of the payments layer through really misclassifying goods, the value of goods, the description of goods, the origin of goods, etc. And then finally, and it's been spoken about at this conference by the AFP Commissioner and others, this sort of grey zone hybrid threats that are emerging where you've got state-based actors bringing on transnational serious and organised crime to do their dirty work. And that includes in supply chains and across borders. And when you see that, for example, and this is open source, Lachlan, so Russia, the K-Club containerized weapons system.
Yeah. Containers
that actually contain missile systems.
Yeah.
And what Ukraine successfully achieved in Russia with Operation Spider's Web, where they conceal drones in trade, containers or trade type containers. So when you look at these threats that are now present around the supply chains, including affecting Australia, I would say that our systems are just not geared up to identify those threats. Moreover, there's a huge opportunity. There's a lot of data in government. There's a lot of data with industry. So we haven't built the architecture to connect the data, first of all. And if we don't do that, we can't introduce machine learning, AI, and these other tools that can join the dots and give us automated threat and risk detection. So I'll stop there. I think there is a technology deficit, and the community consultation goes to that capability gap. And I think we can talk further about that.
Before I throw to you, Alan, on that, Mike, do you think there's benefit? I mean, clearly there's been an underinvestment in the system. So, yeah, when we're talking about the resilience of the system and you're talking about an integrated cargo system that's a quarter of a century old, I mean, I don't think I even have the mobile phone I had a quarter of a century ago. It's in a dumpster somewhere. So it's obviously very old technology. Is it a matter of upgrading what we've got, or is it more a matter of integrating the systems for trade, for people, into one sort of do it all at once, or is it keep them siloed?
No, we can't keep them siloed. I think risk is too cross-cutting. It doesn't sit within silos. We talked about how these convergences occur, and even the way we look at the border, Alan, it looks differently, and the threats and risks are different. So what I would say, though, is the way we regulate industry has to change in this world, because industry have data, they have technology, they have digital architecture, they have knowledge, and they have horsepower. And we heard it today in this discussion. And they have capital that they're willing to invest if it pays a dividend.
Yeah.
So I think that it would be possible for government to work with industry to modernise the border in a far more thoughtful way, particularly around new and emerging airports and those sorts of things. And I would pose a question: why is the government in the business of X-raying containers when you have experts in industry who move containers all day, every day? Yeah. And I ask that question because potentially you could make that commercially viable for industry to provide those X-ray images to government securely, and for government to be analytical there. So that's a question. It's a hypothetical question, but they're the sorts of questions we should be asking.
Yeah, but they're not being asked.
No.
And so, and that's obviously about improving the systems to make them more resilient, to basically defend our border against the threat, right? On the flip side of that, there's plenty of people, and I can hear Tourism Australia right now saying, no, people need to move faster through. And that's where it comes to the movement of goods and the good movement of people rather than the movement of goods so much. Not that there can't be people who are bad actors. Our economy relies on the movement of people into Australia, whether it's skilled migration, whether it's foreign students, whether it's tourism. How do we, looking at COVID, looking at the impact on the major hubs in the Middle East right now, what have these disruptions taught us about how we can maintain the mobility of people across the border that we need?
Yeah, maybe if I jump on that one first. First, just to talk about the technology point briefly, and fully agree with you, need for modernisation of systems, and we're still not at this point for the border that Five Eyes partners have been talking about for, a decade, where you can walk up, you get a face scan, and that does your security check, and either the door opens or it doesn't. Has been the aim for a decade. We're still not there, but there's also the behind the scenes processing systems, which are famously outdated and labyrinthine and conflicting with each other, that lead to large backlogs, which reduces the quality and efficiency of processing and so forth. And that was really identified in the Parkinson review of the migration system, that this was a major area of exposure, was the lack of a modern processing system, processing technology. So it's still not there. And then another aspect of what's the role of technology in this space is cyber. We're really, despite this word having been around now for more than half a century, it's still in the very early days of really understanding how this is transforming society. And, the way that social media has changed the nature of social identity in groups, the way that groups form and maintain themselves over time is just changed as a result of social media. And we're not we're not really at the stage quite of fully understanding that, let alone knowing what that means for how a national security system should regulate that. So that whole world is metastasizing before us. So that's another kind of technological frontier of understanding and modernizing the border. But your next question is about the COVID. What has that taught us?
In terms of how do we keep that flow of people, whether it's COVID or more minor impacts, but still significant, like on the hubs in the US now.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the big lessons from COVID was, again, the risk in a big crisis is not so much that bad actors are going to come across the border or that you'll, lose some kind of critical technology by allowing a nuclear scientist to leave or something. It's really that we have a large temporary population who have precarious status in this territory and are liable to evaporate during a major crisis. And that leaves us, critically vulnerable in key industries when a large portion of our workforce is temporary.
And just to clarify for the audience, when you say evaporate, you mean those temporary migrants are going to disappear into the population because they're worried about their visa status.
Oh, they might leave. It might be the case that the Prime Minister might say to them, "Okay, you were welcome here before COVID. It's time to go home."
Yeah,
which actually happened.
Yeah.
The student migration flow into Australia is the biggest temporary migration flow. So this kind of draws attention to a wider sort of both understanding of the nature of risk when it comes to humans crossing the border. And, it's about insiders and outsiders within the territory rather than at the physical border, but also the different nature of risk. It's not quite the risk that we think about dangerous outsiders. It's about, well, if we have our critical industries and our labour market dependent on people who, by definition, we're not including in society, that is a risk in terms of sovereign capability. It means we don't necessarily have the capacity to do what we need to do by ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's what COVID showed us.
Yeah. And just looking at, we've talked about risk, we've talked about the economic need. How do you balance the risk and reward or the risk and need? How do we find that sweet spot? Is it just a matter of constant analysis, or is there a way of saying, well, we can carve out these parts and these parts are good. We can carve out those parts because they're bad, and then we'll worry about the bit in the middle. I mean, is it a hybrid? Mike, you manage the border.
It's a great question, because when I came to the customs as it was in 2015, I was told, oh, it's this facilitation versus security. So if we squeeze on security, we're going to slow it down. Don't do that. We want industry and the economy to succeed. And if you didn't worry about risk, you just wave everyone and everything through.
Yeah.
Friction wouldn't be a problem. The question then is, have we got the balance right, as you say? And I look at the border in terms of assurance and throughput, basically, and they have to work in combination with each other. And that old paradigm, I don't think holds true anymore, because it's possible now to have both, but you need visibility. And I would say at the moment, let's take an example of, based on A&A audits, I can say that in early 2000s, the Border Force X-ray examined about 7% of containers. If you 7%. If you overlay that with growth in trade, it's probably about 1% today. In the 99%, the Illicit Tobacco Enforcement Commissioner said recently, just over half, I think it is, of all tobacco in Australia is illicit. And there's about an $11 billion revenue gap because of it. And if you look at the wastewater analysis, we're probably finding about 20 to 25% of the narcotics coming into the country on a good day. So clearly the level of assurance we have in the 99% isn't that flash.
Yeah.
And I don't think industry are complaining because things are moving. So on the throughput side, I think we're doing okay. But on the assurance side, it's very poor. If we had visibility of those supply chains and those travel pathways through better data and better technology, I think you can have both throughput and assurance at the right level.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I guess another way to rephrase what you said is about efficiency and security. Yeah. And I think what you're getting at in a way is that needs needs really change, and it comes back to your emphasis on resilience. Resilience being the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining that boundary between inside and outside. And we've gone through this long period where, I think Claire O'Neill talked about this when she was briefly Home Affairs Minister, and talked about how we've gone through this period of extending supply chains for efficiency reasons. So everything is absolutely optimized to the nth degree, but that relies on a much more stable international environment than we have now. And so risk is introduced, systemic risk is introduced by that sort of focus on efficiency. And then now we're going through this, we've had this long period of globalization, and now we're going through a period of deglobalization. And so the imperatives are more around de-risking, decoupling, closure. How do we become more self-reliant? I guess the question is, there's always going to need to be a balance between those two, but the balance between them changes over time, and the ability to adapt to the different circumstances is what's resilience. That doesn't give you a practical answer to what we actually, how we get the perfect balance, but hopefully it gives a perspective on what resilience means. It means the ability to balance those two things in different ways according to the needs of the circumstance.
And I think if I could just build on what I said, I agree with him entirely, that today, if you think about it, we might have multiple different sets of trading rules with multiple different partners. And you're only ever a tweet away from a change in tariffs, for example.
Not referring to anyone.
And so that's the world we're now living in. And I agree entirely with that, because if you have, therefore, visibility of your supply chains and of the goods that are coming down them, frankly, and the traveller pathways, you can adapt those settings much more quickly, and you can predict, almost get ahead of the risk and respond much more quickly, and you can measure the performance and the impact of your policy changes almost in real time. You've heard of digital twins. They're emerging now in supply chains and imports and these other areas. And I think it's going to be possible to handle those shifts in risk with much more agility, but you have to have the architecture first, and it starts with sorting out our data.
Okay, well, last question. Prime Minister's just given you both the same opportunity to change one thing in the border system over the next decade that will make the biggest difference. What is it and why? Mike?
Okay, well, I'll start. In my paper, one of my recommendations is that we need a strategy for our border. Our border is this amazing economic and national security asset that's of such immense strategic value for our country, and there is no plan for it. We don't know what good looks like. We don't know how to invest in it. We might not have the money to invest in it. We don't know whether we can get industry to do more, and we can encourage more investment. But the first thing I would say is we need a strategy for the border. And underneath that strategy, of course, you would work out what are the new investment mechanisms we can create with industry. How can we do co-design before we get to procurement? All of those, and you see some of that innovation in the defence space now. But I think we have to think very, very differently. We can't build a border that's match fit for this world we live in, relying on portfolio budgets and budget cycles.
Alan?
Maybe I'll cheat a little bit, Lachlan, and give two. One would be concentrate expertise on people movement in one department. This has, I think, been a sort of an unsuccessful experiment in dispersing that capability across government. And because of the special kinds of concerns, risks, opportunities that the movement of people brings, which is different from the movement of cell phones or, trade across borders. It requires a certain, constellation of expertise that needs to be concentrated. So that'd be one thing, basically reinstitute the Department of Immigration as a interdisciplinary capability. And then the other would be around the way that we manage stock and flow. So if you think of the border, again, in a conventional sense as a barrier that's passed through, you're interested in flows, you're interested in throughput. And in the migration space today, we have a big debate based on that, which is about net overseas migration, a measure of flow. Now, this is a kind of flow that we some aspects of it we can control and some aspects of it we can't. And so that leads to a very diffuse, heated debate. Whereas if you look at the border slightly differently, as incorporating physical elements, but also having this insiders and outsiders approach as well, it leads you to want to focus on the stock of people, the population of migrants, rather than the flow of migrants. And so a really good idea for how to change that migration debate is, instead of focusing on the net flow across the border, is focus on the stock. This is how Canada's doing it now. They have a stock target for the temporary population. Australia could have a similar approach where we say, okay, rather than worrying about monthly changes in flows, we're aiming for a stock which is a set percentage of the population, and that provides us with planning stability over the long term, which is directly connected to the kinds of issues that people actually care about, you know, housing, infrastructure, services, social cohesion. That's all about a stock rather than a flow. And, you know, we can put aside these questions of, if we think about the border in a different way, we can put aside these sort of distracting discussions about little noise and fluctuation in a flow and concentrate on a stock.
Professor Alan Gamlen, Mike Outram, thank you. We didn't even get to illegal migration, and we've still got plenty of controversial sound bites. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lachlan.
Thanks.